Hi, my name is Hari Dilip Kumar with the DAV Data for SDG Thought Leaders interview series. Today, I'm thrilled to be chatting with Pratha Jawar, who is a renewable energy and climate change researcher and analyst. She's currently associated with the Center for Science and Environment and has more than 8 years of experience in areas ranging from engineering, development, management, policy research, and advocacy. Her work on various projects has had a significant impact on the adoption of decentralized renewable energy systems in India. Earlier, Pratha has worked with Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited, or BHEL, in Bangalore for more than 4 years in the capacity of a product engineer for solar photovoltaics. Apart from this, she is a Chevening Scholar for an MSc in Environmental Technology from Imperial College in London. And further, she has a BTech in Electronics Engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology, Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi. So, Pratha, we've had a couple of conversations. I really am, super thrilled to have you here. We've had several entrepreneurs, being interviewed in the past for this series, but you are the first policy research advocacy kind of person, and you also have the engineering background. So, first of all, a very warm welcome to you. And I think it's going to be a thrilling experience for me, and I hope that the students, entrepreneurs, and data scientists who might be watching this and anybody else will also profit from this interview.
Uh, Thank you so much, Hari, and I feel so good to be here.
Okay, that's awesome. So, as you know, this series is about data science, and how that's leveraged for sustainable development. So, in this regard, maybe we could start with your work at the Center for Science and Environment. So, you do policy research, journalistic writing, advocacy. Could you tell us how you create value through these different activities, and for which stakeholders?
Sure. I want to start by saying that CSE is a 4 decades old non-governmental organization, one of the oldest, biggest, working in all aspects of environment, be it water, air, education, etc. I work in the renewable energy program, and from the inception of the program, we focused mainly on decentralized development by improving energy access through renewable energy sources, while accommodating environmental and social externalities. So, as we continue to pursue this, we have also expanded our focus to mainstream renewable energy and decarbonize the power sector, so the large scale deployment.
Yeah,
Through this program, we endeavor to ensure the development and implementation of renewable energy policies, plans at national, local government level
yeah,
that lead to that large scale deployment of renewable energy technologies, solar,
understood.
wind,
Yeah,
in in various sector of economy to meet both the objectives of combating climate change
yeah,
and as well as energy security.
absolutely. Yeah,
So this we do by conducting policy research based on ground level situation analysis,
yeah,
and that is what gives CSE a unique place and voice, which is reflected in its advocacy drives.
absolutely.
So to answer the second question, so what work we do, it creates value for all stakeholders involved in any capacity, I can say.
Yeah,
So let me explain this with an example.
yeah,
So, for instance, if we are working on a project for promoting clean cooking in the villages,
yeah,
so our work will positively affect millions of women who are still using biofuels, will improve both the health and productivity.
yeah,
But it won't stop there. So, this will also improve the health of all other family members in the house.
yeah,
Then, next, it might for some small time it might adversely impact the informal sector developed around it,
yeah,
but then it will offer them other opportunities, people involved there, while developing a market for, say, gas cylinders or induction cook stoves.
yeah.
So more importantly, it will give important indications to the government to
Mhm.
focus on some of the particular kind of policies, like either subsidizing gas cylinders or developing low cost induction. So take up such kind of plans.
Understood.
So hence whole ecosystem is affected in a positive way.
Yeah.
And in the process, we also eliminate emissions and address climate change.
Fantastic.
So
So what I'm getting is that, I mean, obviously I'm aware of CSC, one of the world's best think tanks in environmental policy, if I'm not mistaken. And I am a regular reader of Down to Earth as well, including some of your articles, which I've seen. And I, in fact, it's my first go-to reference when I want to learn about anything related to, the politics of environment and so on and so forth. So what's clearly coming across is that, it's not just writing which you do or journalistic writing. There is research which is uh, creating outcomes for a large number of stakeholders, starting from the communities who might be involved, to the marketplace players who might be involved, to the government functionaries who might need to create regulation and policy, and of course the readership of the magazine as well, which includes people like me, for example, and influences mass opinion on this. So thank you for that introduction to what work you do and how you do it. I think that was very informative. Um, my question would be, since we are kind of addressing data for sustainable development, um, we clearly understand that policy research, analysis, and advocacy is essential for sustainable development. But
yes.
could you share why is data important for the kind of work you do when it comes to sustainable energy solutions, climate action, decarbonization, energy security, etc.? And the additional questions which I have is, what happens if policy is not well designed with evidence which is constructed from good data, for example? And in your opinion, is renewable energy policy and climate policy in India currently well designed based on data? And please be frank over here, and you're the researcher, you know all the gaps, so do share it with us.
Okay, so as I mentioned, analysis of ground reality is one of the major part of the policy research, and hence the advocacy. So this could be qualitative or quantitative, but to capture the differences, variability along with trends or commonalities, it is important to have as many data points as possible. And we live in such a diversity, and imagine that a policy that is announced based on very limited data collected from just few places maybe. So can you think such a policy will be successful in all states throughout the country? So yes, if it is a general one, but not for all, especially if you think that some other factors, for example, say geography plays some role. So geography plays a major role in both climate change and sustainable energy solutions.
I see.
And I would give an example of solar water pump as a solution for alleviating agricultural as well as power sector financial distress. So it allows farmers to take complete control on the groundwater extraction. And but such pumps cannot be deployed in whole country with the same model.
I see.
So this data is required to understand the dynamics of various regions that should be reflected in the policy. Otherwise, some regions might end up in extreme water stress situation, while other regions might not be able to use it optimally.
Understood.
So let me go through the topics of renewable energy and climate change you asked one after another. The deployment of renewable energy in India is largely driven from the ambitious target India has announced. So we have this 175 gigawatt by 2022 and 450 gigawatt of renewable energy installation by 2030. These are targets announced by government. So one disclaimer, when I'm talking about renewables, I'm mostly talking about the solar, wind, biomass, and small hydro, which is less than 25 megawatt.
Yeah.
And it doesn't include other forms of renewables.
Yeah.
So, there. So the point is, there has been no rationale behind these numbers, the targets which are announced.
I see.
And moreover, despite clear co-benefits of decentralized deployment of renewable energy, the major push in India is being given to large scale deployments. And because why, it is easier as the market forces handholds the government. So we are so happy to see that, okay, solar has reached 1.99 rupees of tariff. But is it what is required when country as a whole wants energy security or energy access as its goal?
Understood. So lots and lots of points there. So where you started from is the fact that our country is very diverse. And if we want to ensure good sustainable development outcomes across this diversity, then we need policies which, when enacted, are either designed with diversity in mind or can be deployed in a way, let's say, that they become contextualized to the geography. And when you say geography, it makes a lot of difference to how sustainable development works in India or will practically work. I'm assuming that you are factoring in things like agroecological zones and water stress and the kind of even cultural preferences, what is cultivated there locally.
Yes, with the example of solar pumps, yes, these all should go into consideration when the policy is designed.
Understood. And one example which you're taking from your own work in decentralized renewables is solar pumps. So I'm assuming that solar pumps falls under decentralized renewables because these are small pumps,
yes,
which farmers can use without heavy investment, which they can use to guarantee their own control over their water to some extent.
Actually, solar pumps are quite expensive.
I see.
Government is subsidizing those very heavily. So in some states, it is subsidized up to 90%.
Yeah.
But in general, I guess farmers have to pay some 30 to 40%.
Understood. But I think one of the main points which came out in terms of policy design over here was that there has been no rationale for the very gigawatt scale targets which have been laid out and the implementation plan for those. What I'm sort of picking up from you is, since you come from the decentralized renewable energy world and you've worked on solar pumps, it's perhaps your belief that a decentralized approach to implementing these targets or any targets would be uh, the appropriate way to proceed. But you feel that the policy may have been designed, from the market forces perspective. Let's have these big, huge power plants, which has more centralized, of course. But the question which you are still raising is, will this guarantee the energy security of our country, right? And will this guarantee energy access?
Exactly.
Right,
so yes, that's true that to give a push to renewables, it was required that first to bring the costs down.
Yeah.
But once the costs are at grid parity or even lower than that, probably now it's time to shift our focus more to decentralized one. Understood. Where it has more benefits.
Understood. So I have some questions here. Like, it's very interesting you bring this up. Your own work, I believe, has been, of course, related to decentralized renewables.
So I have parallelly analyzed a lot about the large scale as well.
I see. So my question basically is, since you can see the large scale in comparison with DRE, right? Or decentralized renewable energy, of course. How do you decide what model is appropriate in what geography? So what indicators are you looking at, which you feel that perhaps the people who designed the or implementing the centralized like huge renewables approach are missing? So can you talk about what kind of data has been important for you to gain this kind of insight into decentralized renewable, and how did you use the data? How did you collect it? How did you use it?
Uh, well,
You could share examples from your own experience, but you could also, feel free to talk about, like other examples.
okay. See, as I said, that it was important in early 2020s and 2010s, basically. So last 2 decades, that
Yeah,
uh, renewable was quite costly,
yeah,
and it was required that it should the cost should come down.
yeah. The levelized cost.
Yes, but then we hit this 2.44 rupees per kilowatt hour for solar in May 2017.
I see. So that was the tipping point in some sense.
Yeah, for that time, yes, it remained the lowest for a long time,
Yeah.
until I guess November 2020, when we got no June 2020, when we got some 2.36
Yeah.
rupees per kilowatt hour, and then it went below, and currently it's 1.99.
I see. Yeah.
So yes, okay. We are now established when it comes to
Yeah.
large scale deployment.
Understood. Yeah.
Uh, but then, from my own experience, and when I talk about electricity excess,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, we have this program called
Yeah.
Sobhagya scheme,
Yeah.
and under that, government is now claiming that we have electrified almost all households, barring a few, or like more than 99%. We have
Okay.
electrified.
Okay.
Uh, but the definition of electrification is that one line, every households get that electricity line, and they can switch on fan and one tube or one bulb, something like that.
I see. I see. I see.
But it does not talk about how, for how many hours.
Understood.
So if we don't know, like, for how many hours it will work, so the electrification doesn't um doesn't gives you that intended benefits.
Understood. So this is actually something which might be interesting to unpack in the light of the SDGs, right? So SDGs are all about human development, as well as climate mitigation, as well as, like, SDG 7 is access to clean energy, so on and so forth, right? So basically, the indicator which the government is using to claim it's reached more than 99% electrification, according to you, is an indicator which allows for a lot of inclusion up to that 99%, where, but it may not translate to the actual sustainable development.
24/7.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So is there some correlation between the number of hours of energy access you get and the level of human development you have? And should we be factoring that into how we measure the success of electrification?
oh yes. So there's a very beautiful graph used by Bill Gates in his latest book, and
Okay.
I think he has referenced it.
Yeah.
So it shows that how productivity goes up
Yeah.
as the electrification increases.
Yeah. So
Uh, so I have personally seen, I have surveyed some villages,
yeah.
and there are issues with the kind of electrification we have currently.
Yeah.
I uh, but first I would say that yes, this is a huge achievement.
Yeah.
Getting electrified every household, it's a huge achievement for a country like India, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But it's not there we can stop.
Very, very nice point, Pratha. So it's a first step where they get
Yes.
access to an electricity grid, but the
Hmm.
actual electricity flowing in that grid for a certain specified amount of time is tied to human development and sustainable development outcomes. And even if you're tied to the grid, if you don't get 4 hours of electricity a day, or half a day of electricity, then how will your kids study? How will you go off your, like your wood burning stove to some other kind of thing, perhaps? I don't know. Or how could you use lights, or how could you?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's where it brings us back to the decentralized renewable energy.
Yeah.
So what happens that when grid reaches to certain place, and in remote areas or in far-flunched areas,
Yeah.
the cost of supply increases.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so just imagine like for government to supply a very far off village and a very poor person
Yeah.
who is not able to pay for that kind of
Yeah.
so for government it becomes a burden,
Yeah.
and certainly like that's why they cannot provide 24/7 in those areas. So what
Understood.
happens, that's where the solution of decentralized renewable energy kicks in. So you produce the energy just in your backyard or
Yeah.
uh, in your field or farm,
Yeah.
and you can use it there only, and in that way you are also minimizing the losses which we generally have when the electricity is transferred from one place to another place.
Understood. So what I'm getting from this whole conversation is that when we try and find the benefits of various schemes, like you mentioned Saubhagya scheme, and you mentioned we have to factor in like a range of indicators which are related to not just the kind of like metrics of like how many the line has been brought to a house,
Exactly, yes.
and we have to look at the human development indicators as well, or the sustainable development indicators, and we have to factor them in when we find out how much benefit is even there from DRE, for example, right? We'll have to,
Yes.
if we do research to say, okay, fine, if we subsidize decentralized renewables in these areas, first of all, are they suited for those areas? We may have to consider a range of indicators, and
uh, Okay, so we are very lucky. India is a land where sun shines almost 300 days
yeah,
in a year,
yeah,
and throughout its geography. So
yeah,
sun is not a problem. And when we talk about decentralized solutions, mostly these are based on solar. So it's very easy that you can put a solar rooftop on the roof
well, I was
is.
thinking more in terms of the financing models might have to be based on the kinds of demographics. But of course, I guess this is like fairly straightforward and for people to do, like for.
Yes. So, okay. So the financing model, coming to that. So, what happens like in small villages, you have to. It's not the personal asset which will be very viable.
Right, right, right,
So
right.
so in that case, you have to think about a small microgrid sort of
Understood, understood.
solution.
Yeah, yeah. Community
So
owned. Right, right, right.
yeah, it can be community owned, or it can be a business owned thing.
Yeah,
But you won't be surprised that even such kind of businesses are profitable,
yeah.
because there are some commercial small scale shops or small scale industries,
Yeah.
which if they get power,
So
a
I
reliable power,
I understand.
it makes
Yeah,
much more sense to
yeah, yeah.
them than to get cheaper power for erratic hours.
Understood. So this is like the Grameen Shakti model, right? Obviously, you'd be knowing about this. The Grameen model, where they subsidized, systems, microfinance, solar home systems in Bangladesh, and they had
Yes,
millions.
yes, yes.
As a
So
matter of fact, I
all
had,
such kind of models
yeah,
can help.
I actually worked in Bangladesh with the Grameen Group, so I was,
Okay.
but that's a different story. I was actually working on distributed renewables, building energy marketplaces with a company called Soulshare there. But that's a story for another time.
Oh,
Yeah,
great
but
to know.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I really am connecting with a lot of these things which you're talking about. So let's move to another question. In our previous conversation, you were telling me about how, for you as a researcher and as a journalist as well, you don't you feel that sometimes people overemphasize quantitative data with respect to qualitative. So, I feel this is a very valuable point because you are generating stories and then influencing people and stakeholders, using data, which could be both qualitative and quantitative. So, could you talk about, the relationship between the quantitative and the qualitative, and how one leads to the other, perhaps, or how do you see them in relation to each other? Perhaps with some examples.
Sure. So, in this world of artificial intelligence and big data sets,
Yeah,
we are losing on information generated through experience over years.
I see.
So, I do agree quantitative approach has its own pros, but then there are some cons. And one of my supervisor, he once said that if you pressurize numbers too much, they will say what you want to say. So, so
There's also this book, right? It's called How to Cheat and Lie with Statistics. I don't know if you've seen this book.
okay, okay.
Yeah,
So yeah, certainly. So it in fact, the previous example I was talking about, so saying
yeah,
that okay, 99% is electrified India, but that certainly doesn't show the entire picture.
of course.
So uh, I'll go back to the same example that where we assessed the policy for solar water pumps in India.
Yeah,
So I've done some surveys and talked to farmers, collected information. It was interesting that with their experience, they can tell the impact of warming without even knowing the technical terms, the global warming or the climate change.
right, right, right.
So they could easily tell what is the ground situation or soil situation, what
Yeah,
crops they can grow now or say 10 years
yeah,
ago or 20 years ago.
yeah,
So hence such kind of information, which is not purely numbers,
yeah,
but still helps you paint whole picture and make you understand about gaps more efficiently.
yeah, yeah.
So that is where uh, then comes in picture this qualitative with quantitative analysis, that interlinkage.
Yeah.
So with quantitative, we can then create more evidence,
Understood.
and then support that what they are saying
Understood.
is uh, how it is linked, and then understand the science, and then finally we can extrapolate and understand what it will be like in future. So
Understood.
the analysis finally based on the synthesis of both
Understood.
helps to determine what actions are required to take and how policy should be designed so that it's benefit to the stakeholders, and to create sustainable environment, and like
Understood.
to maximize gains not just on the economical terms but
Understood. Understood.
social and environment as well.
Well, there's a lot of goodness in that on your answer, Pratha. Like I'm getting so many things. One is the synthesis part, right? It's actually like reminds me of the empirical method which people use for the creation of scientific knowledge, right? You
Yes,
start with some qualitative observations which might be hypotheses, right? Like a farmer
yes.
tells you, I know we can't grow this crop because of some so and so, and then you collect data to either back your hypothesis or to refute it, right?
Exactly.
Through the null
Yes.
hypothesis. And you can do this systematically in the policy domain as well, where you can through participatory methods pick up on these qualitative statements which you can then ground using more quantitative approaches. And the other aspect, like I said, was the participatory approach which I'm getting. So I can see that you have a great respect for native knowledge and indigenous knowledge which is already there in our people and farmers and things like this, which you
Yes.
feel perhaps has not been factored enough into how policy has been designed, right? But perhaps there's a space for for NGOs like CSC and others to work in that gap, right? To
Definitely.
yeah.
Yes. And good to see that a lot of grassroots level NGOs are working in this direction. Even CSE on its part does that regularly.
Well, I mean, that's good to hear. I think there have to be a plurality of actors for there to be a like that risk of having the badly designed policy, right, which we were talking about earlier. I think it needs many different perspectives to be factored in. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. Is it happening appropriately in our country? But maybe we won't sort of go there right now. But I think the takeaway for me is that we need the qualitative, but we need the quantitative as well, and we need the ability to be okay with statements which we don't know the complete truth of, which we then look for evidence for, right?
Yes.
That's fantastic. So, okay, so I'd like to ask you, a question which is related to, again, policy and data. And the question is, in your opinion, is the data required to generate this good evidence-based policy, right, which we were just talking about, where we ground hypotheses with data? Is the data easily available for climate action, sustainability, renewable energy, energy security? Or are there gaps in the data itself? Because how do you ground a hypothesis if you don't have the data, right? And can you share an example from your experience, perhaps, where you found some gaps, and how did you work around those gaps? Because you're not in a lab where you can control everything. You're in the real world with a time limit and a budget limit, right? So how do you
True.
how did you get around it?
Um, sure. So data is required to generate good evidence-based policy recommendations, no doubt about it, especially in the field of clean energy, climate action, and sustainability. The data is very limited. I can't comment on other fields, but yes, in my fields, having authentic and required data is one of the biggest challenges. And I would like to give examples in all these three fields: the climate change, sustainability, and renewable energy.
Yeah.
So as you know, the solar and wind are so erratic. And in one of my project, I wanted to understand that how much renewable energy the existing grid can handle, and how the demand supply can be maintained with high proportion of renewables.
Yeah.
And this question required me to analyze data about how much power is curtailed in a particular area on a given day. So if there is, what happens if there is over generation from a solar or wind plant, which is higher than the demand at that time, so excess power is back down. So which means that even it was generated, but it is not absorbed by the grid. So, however, any data on curtailment is not easily available in public domain. Hence, it becomes extremely difficult to understand as what share of solar and wind is actually best suited for our country at the moment till the batteries arrive. And
that's pretty interesting, because wouldn't you imagine that solar power plants would have like meters built into them and data logging systems? Is it that they don't want to release the data, or that they don't record the data, or that the systems for recording the data are not there, or that I don't understand where the gap is arising from?
It's very interesting. So at a power plant level, of course, they must know that what they are generating.
They must,
And
right?
yes, and at substation level, they will know that how much they are taking.
Otherwise, how will they pay for it, right?
But then, yeah, we don't have data. So
I mean, what you're saying is when you were doing your research, they didn't give you the data.
Yes. So what happens, that's the gap I have found, that it's not available. So in that case, you have to reach out to those power generators at personal level, request them to provide that kind of data, or to reach out to some associations which might have collected that data from them.
Correct.
So you have to do that on personal level, because it's not in public domain.
Understood. So you probably go to like somebody who buys the power, and who's in whose interest it is to like work with you, like an RWA, for example, or some other kind of association, and ask them personally to let you have the data, right?
Yes.
You can't directly get it from even if it's a public utility which is generating it, you can't directly get it from them.
No.
Okay, but you worked around it through the personal network and through working with other stakeholders apart from the actual power generator, and you picked up this data on curtailment, as you put it, which is the data of how much energy is actually like lost because there's nothing to absorb it, right?
Exactly. Yes. And while working for the climate action, we came across that a lot of private companies are now declaring that net zero targets. Yeah, it's a new buzzword. So, however, there's no data in public domains or very limited data with from which it is not possible to analyze or to understand what pathways they are going to take or how they are going to achieve these goals. So it necessitates to get in touch with each company at personal level or through some researchers to access such information and to understand what methodologies they will be using or will be used. So this whole process becomes very time consuming and
That's true.
frustrating.
If I can just interject over here, I believe the SEBI has the regulatory body has introduced some norms recently where the top 1,000 companies in India by market capitalization, that's the have to this year they have to, it's voluntary, I believe, to make some ESG related and disclosures, but from next year I believe it's going to become mandatory. And I believe this is investor driven mostly because investors don't want to invest in companies which are exposed to climate risks, including physical, policy, and reputational risks, right? And if I consider projects like the Carbon Disclosure Project, for example, I understand that I'm sure you've heard of it, but it was this group of investors which like has gotten thousands of companies, huge companies around the world to disclose, right, what their carbon numbers look like. And even though very few companies in India are disclosed, I think the trend of the future is that investors are going to drive disclosures. So because they are exposed to risk, right? So just thought I'd bring in that point.
Sure. So yeah, that's true. And to add upon that, so gap arises when you know that okay, this is their carbon disclosure,
Yeah.
this is their goal to net zero. But
Yeah.
what happens in between? How are they going to reach there?
Yeah.
What is their plan? Like those all things. Now I think being top of the firms, they have this public responsibility to provide such information. Otherwise, what happens, like how will you monitor their progress if they are really doing this or not? So because mostly the plans are for 2050, you
true.
won't know whether
Very true.
this.
I think it's a double-edged sword, Pratap, because there are a lot of startups and entrepreneurs who are going to be watching this. So my message to them would be, okay, you heard the problem statement from Pratap. You have these giant corporations which need to be able to track their carbon so that people believe their disclosures, especially investors. So if you have a solution which is based on emerging technologies, etc., uh, like which can say how much carbon is associated with a like with a dress or a retail product which is being sold in a traceable manner, right? This is a solution which the world needs, right, to plug these data gaps. So I think we've got a fair picture of the kinds of data gaps which are there, and
Yeah, in fact, I want to add one more
please,
example here.
yeah,
In the field of sustainable development,
yeah,
where distributed RE is apart from many other co-benefits, also creates jobs,
yeah,
which is, and you will be surprised to know that we actually do not have data on so far how many jobs are created in this sector and what was the overall impact of it.
oh, that's
So
I'm understanding where you're coming from. So you're saying the input numbers are there, like how much we spent on the scheme, but the outcome numbers, like how much did it
yes,
actually create, is we have not gotten that accountability yet, right?
exactly.
Yeah, that's
And moreover, like getting granular data is so difficult.
so. I mean, this is I would just say to any government folks or any other folks who are watching this interview, uh, I think maybe it's time we moved away from like just an input based focus to something which is where we're measuring outcomes in a traceable manner, just like companies need to, on how effective our schemes are, like how many jobs are created or how many livelihoods are created or how much all these other co-benefits which are supposed to be delivered by these options are. So these are fantastic points, Pratha, and I'm sure that the answers to these are not simple, but at least the questions have to
Yes.
be raised so that we can discuss them, and maybe somebody out there listening knows how to solve these problems. So thank you for these insights, really fantastic insights on the data gaps and how to address them. So um, I just have one more question before, which is pretty important from your perspective. Um, a lot of your work is about influencing policy. That's what advocacy is, in my understanding. And you're working with data, and we're talking about data right now, and we've been talking about data. So,
Yes.
can you tell me how do you, communicate to your stakeholders, and when you need to influence them, what role do things like data visualizations play? And do you think that, could you share some of your insights on this? How do you influence people with data, especially through, maybe interactive visualizations or visualizations? I don't know. What,
Okay, I think it's quite a straightforward question because data visualization is extremely powerful tool
I see.
for conveying your thoughts or ideas or even analysis.
Yeah.
So instead of saying in words that the growth rate is this or it's been declining, if I show this through a graph, and I don't have to then further back it up with anything else. I don't have to say anything. So data visualized in that format tells the whole story itself, and it makes easier for convincing anyone. But how it is visualized becomes important then.
Understood.
So I would just give one example. So when I just put a column graph that, okay, this is the cumulative installed capacity of the renewable energy, which is a nice graph going up. But no, that's not the whole story is. So when I put against it, say one line that every year this is the installation, so you can see the line going up or down. That's where you realize, okay, it's not that smooth curve. And then if I go further to say even the growth rate of that per year installation is declining,
Mm.
that shows that brings out the complete picture that, okay, the rosy picture I can put from the graph 1 is actually not that rosy. If I put that graph 3, which has more impact, okay, we have to do something about it.
Fantastic. I mean, what I'm taking is that you can construct narratives using visualizations, and it's easy to construct a slightly misleading or a false narrative if you don't zoom into the details. And the real insight comes when you say, okay, fine, but the story seems fine, but what about this? This irregularity looks funny. Can we explain that? So that's where the story is, and it's fascinating that a picture tells 1,000 words, but if you
Yes.
choose your pictures naively, or perhaps like not without enough integrity, then you can end up telling a misleading story, whether by purpose or not. So
Definitely.
so your job as a like somebody who communicates with a variety of audiences is to really bring the true picture. And I think you've done this in this interview as well, Pratha. Like it's been an extremely multi-layered and interesting interview for me, and I certainly have learned a lot. And like I said, I really look forward to this, because you're not the typical entrepreneur running a company using data who we have interviewed so far, but somebody who's using data among many other tools to bring about positive changes towards sustainability and climate action, energy security, and renewable energy. So it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Pratha. Where we would end is, if this was a perfect world, now that we've gotten some understanding of the kind of work which you do, if you had 3 wishes to make your work easier, in short, what would those 3 wishes be? And given that we have a wide audience of entrepreneurs, data scientists, students, government folks, uh, and anybody else who might be listening, we might be able to find somebody who can accelerate your work. So, what are those 3 wishes?
Um, okay. So, to frame a good policy, uh, okay. So basically, what happens that these days we have data from various sources.
Yeah.
You can have multiple sources and multiple data which do not coincide, or to frame a good policy, it is advisable that government data is used so that you can push harder.
Yeah.
However, problem is that the updated government data is not available in many domains.
Yeah.
For instance, if I want to calculate the impact of anything at per capita basis, the
Yeah.
last population data we have is 2011 census,
Yeah.
which is highly outdated, right? So, so my three wishes would be first to have up-to-date data
Yeah.
available, and second to have transparency,
Yeah.
as in case like if there is any issue, who will answer my queries, and how transparent is that data, how it is
Yeah.
collected,
Yeah.
methodologies behind it.
Yeah.
And third, I would say that the government portals to have more broad based information. And when I'm saying that, like I want to know how government interprets some technical words, or like the definition. So as of now, we are talking about net zero, climate adaptation,
Yeah.
but how to go about these? Like how in Indian context, even this definition of let's say waste land is not clear. So I just want to say that yes, there should be more clarification on how things are interpreted.
Understood.
At,
So
yeah,
those are fantastic points, Pratha. So all relating to data, government data. I believe we have quite an elaborate system in the government for collecting data, but it's questionable as to how much of it is made public, of course. And of
yes.
course, we're also talking about open data and qualities such as transparency and good documentation about what things mean. So, Pratha, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I hope you had a good time as well, and I
Same
hope
here, same here.
I'm sure everybody listening also. I hope you guys had a good time, and we'll have to sign off for now. But it's been a great time for this Data for SDG Thought Leaders interview with a real thought leader in the policy, advocacy, research, journalism space for SDG in India, Pratha Jawar from GSC. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, bye bye.